Welcome to everyone. I'm James Jensen, today's webinar chair. I am a contractor supporting the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Today's webinar, titled Utility Scale Solar Development on Tribal Lands, is the 9th and final webinar of the 2021 DOE Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Let's go over some event details. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on DOE's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs website in about 1 week. Copies of today's presentation slides will be posted on the Office of Indian Energy's website shortly after this webinar. Everyone will receive a post-webinar email with the link to the page where the slides and recording will be located. Because we are recording this webinar, all phones have been muted. We will answer your written questions at the end of the final presentation. You can submit a question at any time by clicking on the question button located in the webinar control box on your screen and typing your question. Let's get started with opening remarks from Lizana Pierce. Ms. Pierce is a senior engineer and deployment supervisor for the Office of Indian Energy and is duty stationed in Golden, Colorado. She is responsible for the execution of the deployment program. She has over 25 years of experience in project development and management and has been assisting tribes in developing their energy resources for over 20 years. Ms. Pierce holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado State University. Lizana, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. I join James in welcoming you to today's webinar. This webinar series is sponsored by the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, otherwise referred to for short, Office of Indian Energy. The Office of Indian Energy is chartered by Congress to promote Indian energy development, efficiency, and use, help to reduce or stabilize energy costs, enhance and strengthen Indian tribal energy and economic infrastructure, and to bring electric power and service to Indian lands and homes. To provide this assistance, our deployment program partners with Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages to overcome the barriers to energy development. Our deployment program is comprised of a three-pronged approach consisting of financial assistance through competitive grants, technical assistance at no cost to tribes and eligible tribal entities, and education and capacity building. This Tribal Energy Webinar Series is just one example of our education and capacity building efforts. Specifically, the webinar series is intended to provide attendees with information on tools and resources to develop and implement tribal energy plans, programs, and projects, to highlight tribal energy case studies, and to identify business strategies tribes can use to expand their energy options and develop sustainable local economies. This year's webinar series is focusing on tribal energy projects that can improve community resilience, foster economic development, and support environmental stewardship. In this 9th and final webinar of the series for 2021, we will focus on utility scale solar voltaic or PV development. Utility PV development has different challenges than smaller community or commercial scale developments, and these challenges have contributed to somewhat of a scarcity of utility scale PV development on tribal lands. Today's presentations will provide insights into the utility scale development process and lessons learned from those who have developed their resources on a larger scale. We do hope the webinar and the webinar series as a whole is useful to you. We also welcome your feedback, so please let us know if there are ways that we can make the series better, or if there are ideas or topics that you'd like us to consider for the 2022 series. You can send any of your feedback to our main email address at indianenergy@hq.doe.gov. Before I turn it back to James, I did want to personally thank each of the presenters, Glenn and Edward and John, for giving up their time and their willingness to share during today's webinar. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back to James to introduce the presenters for today. James, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Lizana. As you said, I'll now introduce our presenters. For our first presentation, we will hear from Edward Settle. Since 1989, Edward has been providing technical and economic guidance to investors, developers, lenders, and government. In 2009, Edward joined the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, to lead the highly successful Section 1603 program for the U.S. Department of Treasury, cash payments in lieu of tax credits. The program had over $26 billion for clean energy. He has also worked with several tribes to develop strategic energy plans and renewable energy projects. Prior to NREL, Edward supported project development and financial due diligence for power and refinery projects. His experience has included all conventional and renewable technologies, including natural gas, coal, oil, geothermal, hydropower, biomass, wind, solar, and municipal waste. Following Edward, we will hear from Glenn Steiger. Glenn is currently the executive consultant for the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, or NTUA, where he provides professional oversight to NTUA's major generation, power supply, and transmission initiatives. He was previously the general manager of Alameda Municipal Power in California and the former general manager and CEO of Glendale Water and Power, also in California, where he transitioned the utility through the integration of smart grid technology, water, and energy efficiency. Mr. Steiger has provided energy and engineering and strategic regulatory consulting services to utilities and major energy consumers in the Southwest. Additionally, he has provided internationally recognized water, energy nexus, and smart grid consulting services to utilities in Australia, Brazil, Thailand, China, and numerous European countries. For our last presentation, we will hear from John Leshetsky. John Leshetsky is currently the Senior Advisor to the Executive Director for the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, where he is responsible for leading and advising on outreach activities for the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program, as well as other loan program office programs. He previously was Executive Director for the Army's Energy Initiative Task Force and the director of the DOE Solar Energy Technologies Program. Prior to the government, he held a number of executive roles in the private sector for business development and financing of energy and other advanced technologies. Thanks to all of our presenters today for making the time to join us. With that, let's get started with our first presentation. Edward, you may proceed as soon as we have your slides up. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much, James. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone and with my esteemed colleagues. The opportunity to share my perspective on developing power generation projects. I've been working in this arena for about 3 decades. Prior to NREL, I helped investors understand projects to the tune of over $10 billion. I secured well over 100 permits to construct and operate power plants of just about every kind, except nuclear, all across the country and in the territories. I've certainly been grateful for my time at NREL, working specifically with tribes, trying to help unlock opportunities for power generation and energy storage projects. So today, as we go through my slide deck, you'll see lots of information that you may have seen in other presentations, whether they were mine or presentations by my colleagues at NREL. Additionally, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't shamelessly promote the tools that NREL has developed through the years, including our Tribal Energy Atlas, the PV Watts model, System Advisor model, and others. With strong support from the Department of Energy, of course, we continue decades of energy-related technical assistance to tribes. So I haven't really included an outline for today's presentation, but if I had, it would sound something like this. First, I want to highlight kind of the fundamental shift in power generation that is expected to occur over the next 3 decades, and it's been ongoing for the last decade. Next, I'd like to highlight the opportunity in renewable energy, specifically what that may mean for tribes who are looking for economic diversification, community benefits, and other benefits. Third, I just want to highlight briefly the risks and roles for tribes to consider as they weigh participating in an opportunity such as solar PV development. And then last, I want to discuss the basic process of renewable energy project development. And I'll give you a hint here. It probably looks very similar for most business enterprises on tribal lands. Sam, if I could go to slide 3, please. In slide 3, what I want to do is start with just a preface to the presentation. and talk about what is meant by utility scale, because this is often a point of confusion. What I would suggest is that we're looking at projects that are large scale. I've worked in Alaska where a 660 kilowatt generator is deemed utility scale, but here we're talking about the multi-megawatt type of projects that are grid connected, selling power to others, third parties. So pictured here are two fine examples of great projects. The one on the left being the Moaba River Indian Reservation project in Nevada. The one on the right being the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque. So we're talking more about the one on the left through this presentation. Slide 4, please, Sam. So in recent years, you've heard, seen, read about the tumultuous nature of the transition that we're currently going through as we get away from coal and we go in the direction of natural gas and renewables. So communities in particular that I've worked with, like the Hopi tribe and Navajo Nation, they've been drastically impacted by some of these changes. But based on market policy, markets and policy as currently projected, this slide and the next one actually show the perspective of the U.S. Energy Information Administration as of the beginning of 2021. So as Yogi Berra famously said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So keep your eyes peeled for the 2022 Annual Energy Outlook that's about to be released in January. I predict it's going to show some continued significant growth of natural gas, solar, and wind to meet demand for electricity. But this is always going to change as the future ticks along. Slide 5, Sam. So this slide basically just gives a little bit more granularity to the previous slide and shows the growth of natural gas renewables over the next 3 decades, and also shows specifically how renewable electricity generation is expected to grow. Solar PV, of course, primarily solar PV, you're looking at it essentially in the graph on the right side, going from 16% of delivered energy to almost half of the US delivered energy. And that requires a lot of projects. So in summary, I'll just say, excuse me, that you can recognize from the forecast that there is potential opportunity on a broad scale to help meet the need for more clean electricity generation. So what I want to look at next, and moving to slide 6, is looking specifically at renewable energy and tribal participation. So I believe that purpose is foundational to success, and I think as a tribe considers whether or not to participate in this growth market, why would you consider renewable energy? And of course, you can see that there are multiple factors driving the growth of renewable energy in the past and moving forward, such as favorable tax policy, declining prices. I would also say declining costs of the underlying technology. Energy storage is going to help grow the market further. Mandates, subsidies, corporate investment, community interest, and then of course retirement of coal fleets and so forth. If you go on to slide 7, Sam, this is just a more detailed assessment using a fishbone diagram type approach of what the market drivers are for renewable energy. Clearly, you can see that this is not a market that is expected to decline. Slide 8. So why tribal energy? Why would a tribe consider jumping into something like solar PV or other renewable energy opportunities? Well, some of the things that we've uncovered, they're listed here as kind of my opinion, but also due to some of the surveys and other outreach work that we've done for tribes over the years. really aligns closely with tribal goals in terms of the sustainable use of natural resources, expanding the income base for the tribe, jobs, and capacity building, and then infrastructure upgrades, get the chance to build roads and transmission lines and more. And then, of course, other community benefits. So what we found is that, in fact, renewable energy and renewable energy development can align very well with tribal goals. In addition to these enumerated ones, of course, tribal sovereignty seems to be an overarching element. Slide 9. So the next couple of slides, I just want to highlight that the potential here is actually really good for renewable resources. This one uncovers solar PV in particular, and this comes out of NREL's Tribal Energy Atlas. If you're not familiar with that tool or the underlying documents, I would just encourage you to take a look at it. Maybe I believe there may be some webinars that were recorded and demonstrate the functionality of this particular tool. And you have the ability to select certain filters and so forth to figure out, what the probability is or what your potential is, I guess, for a particular resource. The next slide, 10, actually shows the wind potential, for example. And then the third slide that I've provided, slide 11, is indicative for transmission across the country. And then for a lot of tribes, the transmission issue, the ability to interconnect to a substation and a transmission line and get power from the location to the buyer can be a significant challenge. And so that's I would just highlight that as one particular challenge to focus on, and hopefully that's one that can be rectified as time moves on. Slide 12. By no means does this slide capture all of the community benefits that might be available for a tribe's participation, or any community's participation for that matter, in a solar PV or renewable energy project. It just highlights a few of the categories, such as economic development, workforce development, land lease remuneration, community funds that can be established for certain community needs, and then of course property taxes and infrastructure upgrades. Those are a few of the benefits. I will mention that there's a footnote here that refers to a study from 2011. The key quote that I took from that study is basically that the first 1,000 megawatts of wind energy projects that were developed in Colorado produced about 1,700 construction-related jobs, 300 plus permanent jobs, and an expected 20-year local economic impact of nearly $1 billion. So pretty substantial impact to communities where these projects are being installed. Slide 13. So here's a project that I had highlighted in a presentation probably a couple of years ago. And this just provides some of those categories of economic community benefits, if you will. And this is specific to the NextEra's Perrin Ranch Wind Farm. It's located south of the Grand Canyon, west of Flagstaff, Arizona. There were elements during construction, actually during development and construction and operation, that had to do with the workforce and economic impact, both direct and indirect or induced type of economic impacts. There were education programs that were stood up in a partnership with Northern Arizona University. Curriculum was established and training was provided. There are also donations made to multiple local organizations. And then of course there's the ongoing benefits, which are kind of critical to the community, with the firehouse, EMT training, tax payments to the school district, rebuilding of roads, and so forth. So a pretty important project actually for that community there. Slide 14. This is just, this slide offers one approach. This would not be the only approach by any means as well. So one approach to trying to figure out how you maximize community benefits. And when I say maximize community benefits, I want to put that in air quotes, if you will. I probably should have put it in actual quotes in the title, because the caution here, I can't emphasize that enough, that if the project is not competitive, then there are no community benefits whatsoever. And so I think there's an on balance perspective where you want to look at how do we maximize community benefits, but also recognize that the project has to be successful and competitive in order to realize any community benefits. So one of the things that we've done is gone through in the past a competitive RFQ, RFP type process where the goal is really to try to find a strong development company who's very experienced in developing projects to work with. And so early on, while preparing for the RFQ, RFP process, a tribe can actually de-risk the project site and establish a bit of development value, and then go out for the RFP, RFQ process by putting that out there and competitively securing a development partner, if you will. And then, of course, part of that RFP, RFQ process would include the developer speaking to issues such as the construction process. How do you secure tribal jobs preferentially and engage tribal businesses? Additionally, with the operation itself, how do you look to secure tribal jobs for the positions that are available and engage tribal businesses? Can we provide engagement for local high schools or local schools for that matter of any level, education and job training? And then, of course, there's a long-term land lease that would provide a source of revenue, and then look to reinvesting revenues into other opportunities. And then finally, in the operation, I highlight the possibility of considering profits interest or an equity stake with reinvestment. And then finally, post-PPA period, a lot of these projects, and that's power purchase agreement, which you probably already know, but when you have a power purchase agreement, it usually runs for a certain period, say 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, whatever it is, but there gets to a point where you're coming to the post-PPA period, and a tribe may want to evaluate whether or not they want to take over the project at the end of the power purchase agreement period. And then finally, there's the issue of salvage, repower, and that transfer to what may ultimately be a tribal utility. So next slide, please. I could just summarize where we are so far in the presentation. I've highlighted the growth of renewable energy over the next 3 decades. And hopefully you can see how this more or less aligns with tribal goals, and it can benefit tribal communities. So what I want to look at now is basically just really quickly look at risks for development and roles. What this slide shows in slide 15 is generally where risk can be found in the actual financing of energy projects. The most risk is generally found in developing a project. So developers will take a big risk going out and developing multiple projects. And if they get projects to succeed, they require a high return on that investment. For every development opportunity that they invest in and succeed at, there are usually many others that they invested in and end up being a total loss. So to that end, I'd say anything that a tribe can do early on to de-risk a project opportunity should make the project opportunity more valuable and interesting to a developer, and ultimately help with the success of the project. Next slide. So I believe I probably stole this graphic from one of my colleagues, Sherry Stout or Paul Schwab. You probably have heard from them before in these various webinars. But the important point here is that there can be higher risk involving the significant capital outlay if tribes want to participate as an owner or an operator or an investor. So higher risk generally associated with higher reward. But I would say that unless a tribe is well-heeled in energy project development and able to sustain the potential loss, often the less capital intensive roles are pursued. And those are essentially off-taker, if that's a capability, landowner, of course, and O&M subcontractor. Those will be some examples. Slide 17. So here again, I pilfered these slides from my colleagues as well, slide 17 and 18. I won't go through them in detail, but I think the deck is going to be distributed widely, and you'll have the opportunity, of course, to dig down into the various roles that tribes can take in these projects and what those roles might mean from a risk-reward perspective. So with that, after looking at the forecast and squaring that with tribal goals, and then looking at the risks and roles for tribes, I just want to talk briefly now about the process of actual project development. If we go to slide 19. So slide 19 is here I offered one pathway toward project development. And there generally is no singular best approach, I guess. Each opportunity really needs to be evaluated on its own merits and an appropriate pathway chosen. But in this particular pathway here for developing a project, what I've assumed is that maybe a tribe has limited bandwidth, limited capacity, limited resources to actually pursue full-scale development. And so partnering with a highly qualified and experienced developer might be necessary for project success. So the best practice here would be to establish a formal and transparent process where a developer is selected based on an open, competitive process. The idea is to conceive of the project, run a quick back of the envelope type assessment to make sure that there's nothing completely blocking the potential for the opportunity, and then begin to prepare a feasibility study. The feasibility study is something that where you can rely on those cool tools I mentioned earlier, whether it's PV Watts or System Advisor Model or others. They can provide good information input into a feasibility study for a project concept. From there, you might begin to put together a development plan. And what that development plan would do is it would talk about how you're going to get from this feasibility study, if you will, the project concept and feasibility study, through to actual construction and operation. It may not address the issue of your activities during construction and operation, but it would deal with how that's going to be handled, including how things are entitled within the structure of the tribe, what kind of tax issues might play into the financial model, if you will, looking at transmission interconnection studies as a possibility, and then of course maybe exploring potential power purchasers, whether it's a corporation or a utility or someone else, basically looking at what does the development plan look like for this project to move forward. From there, as you continue to, say, de-risk the project, it would be time to go through the RFQ, RFP process, and then select a good development partner who's well qualified and experienced to fully develop the project. They can execute a land lease agreement, and they can also provide the commitments to community benefits. And that leads to ultimately the development agreement. Next slide. So in slide 20, I just basically point to 4 pillars of success, and I'll actually start by saying there's a whole bunch of ways to view project development. For example, one of my friends used to be at NREL, developed what is now a trademarked description, if you will, of project development. It's called SROPTC, SROPTTC. So it's this acronym which agencies are known for coming up with. But SROPTC basically stands for 7 key elements of project development. So you have the site, you have the resource, you have an offtake agreement, you have permits, you choose your technology, you pull together your team, and you secure the capital. And so that's one way to think of it. And you can find, if you just search for SROPTTC online and with NREL, you'll probably find some sort of a project development guidance document, presentations, and so forth that kind of discuss that particular approach. For me, just based on my experience and how I've worked, I tend to use this 4 pillars of success approach. And I basically just think of it in these 4 buckets of resource, making sure you've got a strong sun resource or strong wind resource or whatever you're looking to develop. 2, that you have site control or can secure site control to advance the project. 3rd, looking for a buyer for the product that you're going to be producing. In this case, we're talking about electricity. And then 4th, you've got to have a way to get your product to the market, to your buyer. And that's where interconnection transmission comes in. So those are the 4 pillars that I see to successful project development. And I would just wanted to give a shout out here to Glenn Steiger. He actually let me take this photo at NTUA's Kayenta Solar 2 project. And I'm looking forward to his presentation up next. Next slide. And again, I would just highlight that these are not all of the factors contributing to a successful project, but hopefully thinking of these 4 pillars of success will help organize everything for project development in the right direction. So when you look at slide 21, here's where I provide just a little bit more detail into these pillars of success. First of all, the resource is, you've got to have that strong natural resource, because that's what really relates to the performance of the project and ultimately your revenue stream. To make sure that if you have an investor, they're getting their payments back. If you have community benefits that are tied to this, then that allows for the community to benefit and so forth. So the resource has to be strong. Then again, I'll just mention tools like a tool like PV Watts for a solar PV system is an excellent tool for just an initial glance at what the potential for a particular project site can do anywhere in the country. The second thing on this list is the site control, and that's essentially the point here is that in order for somebody to spend development capital, and certainly for a financier to invest in a project, and these projects are pretty expensive, so in order for them to do that, they have to have some sort of ownership or control of the site. And so that's essentially that long-term lease, if you will, and covering both the early stage development period, construction, operation, and decommissioning on the other side. Additionally, under the site control, I would say that you have to have the ability to secure the permits that you need. So that I kind of include the permitting aspect within the site control. If the project fails for some reason, investors need the ability to either take over the operation or recovery equipment, redeploy it elsewhere, or other options basically that might relate to accessibility of the assets at the particular site. The third pillar here is the buyer, and that's, if you've got a long-term contract with a buyer for the electricity, that's usually considered the holy grail for a power generation project. If you can get a 20-year or 25-year PPA, power purchase agreement, that is the linchpin for successful financing. It gives the investor measure of assurance that their investment is likely to pay off. And then finally is the transmission component. So if you have a resource on an approved project site and a buyer for the power, but you can't get to them because you can't interconnect or transmit power, then the project's not going to go anywhere. So you really have to have that ability to deliver your product to your buyer. Slide 22. So this is a hypothetical project. It was one that we worked on a couple of years ago. And essentially, let me highlight the caution right up front that basically I wrote that caution statement, I think, at the particular time that I put the slide together. And sure enough, the following week, you can see under buyer where it says recent price, the $24.99 per megawatt hour went to $23.76 per megawatt hour in the week. So not all of these change as frequently as that, but certainly as you're looking at putting together a project and you're looking at the four pillars, and you can expect that things are going to move around as you get to the point where you can close on the project and begin construction and operation. I would also emphasize to that end that as you begin to structure documents, even as the developer structures documents, those documents may actually need to change, such as assignability of agreements or transferability of agreements, those kinds of things. There has to be some flexibility there because, in fact, things do change over time. Investors have specific requirements and so forth. So as you get into a specific project, it's probably going to look considerably different by the time you actually finally get it built and operated. But these are just some of the assumptions that I was making at the time that I put this together a couple of years ago in terms of the four pillars. So that's it for my presentation. I just say in closing to this presentation, thank you again for this opportunity. I would say assess your opportunity for renewable energy development, whether it's solar, PV, or others. Assess the opportunity carefully. The market's going to grow, and the tribal goals may align with the opportunity, but you'll want to weigh your risks and decide on the tribe's role, and then forge ahead on the path to success that you've chosen. So I wish you all the best and look forward to hearing of your success. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn.
Thanks so much, Edward. I appreciate the presentation and making relatively simple descriptions of the complicated process that is solar PV development at a utility scale. Next, we're going to have Glenn Steiger present, and he'll present these case studies outlining what NTUA has done on Navajo Nation. And looks like your slides are up.
Okay, James, well, thank you very much. And Edward, that was very interesting. And so given everything that you have put forth, and it's quite comprehensive, I really don't need to present anything, but I will. That was an excellent presentation, and really did cover the various activities that we've seen in developing solar projects. So just to fill in a little bit on my background, James did a good job of discussing my background overall. I've been in the electric, gas, and water utility business for almost 52 years. I have seen the business change dramatically, as many of us have. And each time it changes, I always find that it's exciting to jump in and work with it. and see where it goes. And I find this to be one of those times where, as we develop significant renewable energy sources, it just brings in so many new participants and stakeholders and resources, and just opens up areas that we haven't thought about before. And this is one of them, developing large-scale, utility-scale solar on tribal lands, and tremendous amount of upside potential for this. So can I have my next slide, please? So I'd like to just give you a little bit of an overview of the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, known as NTUA. We were established in 1959 to address the absence of, essentially, of utilities on Navajo Nation. We've grown into a thriving tribally owned enterprise, delivering a portfolio of service to a service area of more than 27,000 square miles. That is, put in perspective, it's the size of West Virginia. And you can see on this slide a layout of Navajo Nation and our 8 districts. Those various colored pieces in the layout show our districts. And the one area, the white area that is to the lower left, is the Hopi reservation. So that's what the NTUA service footprint looks like. We currently provide electric, gas, water, wastewater, photovoltaic services individually, and broadband services to over 42,000 customers on Navajo Nation. But as a side note, and a very, very important one, I want to emphasize the fact that while we serve 42,000 electric customers, there's still 15,000 families on the reservation that have no access to electric at all. So a lot of what we do in developing these large-scale solar projects is aimed at providing additional revenue to allow us to build out to those unserved customers or future customers. And so far, that has worked, and we will continue to develop large-scale projects for that reason, and also to keep rates stable within Navajo Nation. Next slide, please. In 2013, we recognized that the potential for renewable energy on Navajo Nation was significant. And so what we did is created a subsidiary of NTUA known as NGI, or NTUA Generation. And that subsidiary allows us to develop large-scale solar projects both on the nation and off the nation, and allows us to gather tax benefits in that regard. Essentially, NGI is wholly owned by NTUA and has done all the development so far of our solar projects, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. The first one that was developed by NGI was Kayenta 1, a 27.3 megawatt facility located just south of Monument Valley, for those of you that are familiar with the Navajo Nation and the location of Monument Valley. NGI also constructed Kayenta 2, which is adjacent to Kayenta 1, a 27.8 megawatt facility. Again, both projects are fully owned, operated, and maintained by NGI as part of NTUA. We have also partnered for the development of a 100 megawatt solar project in Southern California that will sell the attributes and energy of that particular plant to a California municipal entity. We are in the development stage right now to develop 3 additional projects: Red Mesa, which is 72 megawatts, Cameron, 200 megawatts, and Lachie, 450 megawatts. And essentially, our development initiatives right now will garner us approximately a gigawatt of solar energy by 2024. So the projects that I show here are well within the development stage right now, and I'll talk about them in detail in a minute. And we have some other projects that we are also developing that I can't give you a lot of detail on, but they will also be part of our portfolio. Next slide, please. Next slide. What I've put out here is an overall map of the Navajo Nation in general, and that's that pinkish area, if you can see it. And I've just indicated the 5 plants that I've just mentioned. The one at the top, a little red circle there, that is Red Mesa. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. We're about to start construction of that shortly. The 2 circles to the left of that are the 2 Kayenta projects, which are adjacent to each other outside of Kayenta. To the left of that is the Lpo project, the 450 megawatt project, which is just south of Page, Arizona. And then south of that, below that, the final project is Cameron, which is approximately 80 miles north of Flagstaff, Arizona. But this will give you a sense of also of our transmission facilities. And as you can see, they're fairly robust. So we're very fortunate in the fact that we have a number of areas that we can locate solar projects either adjacent to or very close to existing transmission. Next slide, please. So let me give you an overview of the Kayenta 1 project, which was our very first solar project on the Navajo Nation that was developed, built, and is now owned and operated by the Navajo Nation itself. There are no partners in the Kayenta 1 project. It is solely owned by NTUA as part of Navajo Nation. As I mentioned, 27 roughly megawatt AC single axis tracker located approximately 4 miles north of Kayenta and south of Monument Valley. The total cost for that plant was $55 million, plus an additional $6 million for the interconnection, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. It's sited on approximately 200 acres of land adjacent to the Kayenta 2 project site. The construction of Kayenta 1 created over 230 jobs for Navajo residents and nearly $15.6 million in local benefits. That's significant to an area like Kayenta. Kayenta 1 is interconnected to NTUA's Kayenta Substation, which is more or less adjacent. It's about 1,000 feet away from the Kayenta 1 site. Sells its energy output and environmental attributes via a long-term power purchase agreement, or PPA, with NTUA. So NGI sells to NTUA, and then NTUA has a PPA with SRP, Salt River Project, to sell both the RECs, the environmental attributes, along with a shaped energy output to SRP. We also retained First Solar, which is now known as NovaSource, from Chandler, Arizona, as our operations and maintenance vendor. And they have provided all the operations and maintenance monitoring services since we initially put Kayenta 1 into commercial service. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the site prior to construction. As you can see, it was fairly flat, so we didn't have to do a lot of civil work. We did some. We did grade the area. But one of the things that I'd like to point out, if possible, if you look back towards the bottom of the mesa, all the way in the back of that photo, you see just a couple of houses back there. I point those out because those homes were homes that were unserved by both electric and water. Those homes also were the families that had the grazing rights to the site that we needed to obtain. So one of the things that we did we made an agreement with those folks to provide power and water in exchange for the right to put the solar project on that land. Next slide, please. This is a photo of Kayenta 1 at roughly a little bit more than about 60% construction. You can see the racks are in place. The what's known as combiner boxes, those little metal boxes at the end of all the racks, are in place. And once you start to build the racking systems, the construction goes rather quickly. So construction is not a long-term operation on a solar project. Next slide. This slide shows the interconnection substation. If you recall a minute ago, I mentioned that that particular piece was about a $6 million expenditure. And that takes the energy from the solar farm, which you can see on the right-hand side of the picture, at 24,000 volts, and converts it to 69,000 volts, which then puts it into the NTUA transmission system. What you can't see here in this photo is the existing NTUA/WAPA, or Western Area Power Administration substation, that's about 1,000 feet away. So the energy from this particular interconnection point goes both directly into the NTUA system and also into the WAPA system, which is transmitted in some form outside of the NTUA footprint. Next slide, please. And then finally, this is an overhead view of the completed Kayenta 1 solar project. There were approximately 120,000 solar panels in that photo. Next photo, or excuse me, next slide, please. Now I'm going to move on to Kayenta 2. Next slide. Kayenta 2 is very similar in size to Kayenta 1. It's a 27.8 megawatt solar project, adjacent and literally right adjacent to, on the same site as Kayenta 1. It's been in operation since August of 2019. Kayenta 1 was put in service in May of 2017. So there was approximately a 2-year differential between the operating date of Kayenta 1 versus Kayenta 2. Kayenta 2 is on approximately 165 acres, which is subleased by NGI from NTUA, which leases the land from Navajo Nation. So you can see there's this series of interconnections between NGI, NTUA, and Navajo Nation. The project cost for this, even though it was exactly the same size as Kayenta 1, was substantially less, $44 million. And so what that indicates is the fact that the cost of solar continued to decline from the time that we built Kayenta 1 to Kayenta 2. At this point, however, we've seen pretty much a leveling off of costs. We don't see that kind of decline, but we did see a substantial decline between Kayenta 1 and Kayenta 2. NGI and NTUA have entered into a power purchase agreement for the energy and environmental attributes, RECs, again, with shaped power going to SRP. So the agreements that we have for offtake are both with Salt River Project, SRP, both for Kayenta 1 and Kayenta 2. They both are similar in format. In all the attributes go to SRP, but the energy is shaped. So the energy is shaped to a form that conforms to what SRP needs, not necessarily the output as it comes out of the solar plant, which is a little bit unique. Works very, very well for SRP and actually works for NTUA too. For Kayenta 2, we engaged Swinnerton Energy, Renewable, out of San Diego as the engineering, procurement, and construction contractor for Kayenta 2. We also engaged First Solar, again, now NovaSource, to provide O&M services, very similar to what we've done with Kayenta 1. Construction started in December of 2018 and reached complete commercial operation 2019, roughly an 8 to 9 month construction time for Kayenta 2. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of Kayenta 2 as we started construction. What you can see to the left of the site is existing Kayenta 1. And Kayenta 1 used a dual panel system. So there's two panels working together on the arrays, and that's what you can see back there. Kayenta 1, on the other hand, used a single panel. Next slide, please. So Kayenta 2 used two panels. Kayenta 2 uses one panel, and that's what you can see in this particular slide. You can see it's a single panel fixed axis tracker system. Next slide. And then this is a long shot of the entire Kayenta 1, Kayenta 2 project from about 3 miles away. So you can see it off to the left. If you should go to Monument Valley, you'll see it on the left-hand side. You have to pass it to get to Monument Valley. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of the way we sequenced these two projects and why it worked very, very well from a construction and employment standpoint, the construction requirements were very similar, in fact, almost duplicate to Kayenta 1 and Kayenta 2. We had an existing workforce that we had already trained for Kayenta 1, and therefore we were able to continue to use most of that workforce for Kayenta 2. We actually hired more Navajo workers for Kayenta 2 than we did for Kayenta 1, and we overall used about 2,500 hours of specialized training. The real benefit here is that these folks have been trained to build solar projects for these two projects, but since these projects are now built, of course, they no longer were necessary for these projects, but they have gone on to build, not all of them, but many of them have gone on to build projects outside of Navajo Nation. So the training that they receive for these projects has been beneficial in a very long-term way. Next slide. So some very specific benefits from Kayenta 2 are as follows. The construction generated about $2.2 million in taxes, and that's sales tax, and it's very, very similar to Kayenta 1. So you can see that between $4 and $5 million just in sales tax alone was generated by the construction of those two projects. First year tax revenue was about $144,000, but that converts to $4.3 million over the 30-year life of the project. The folks that worked on the project received $7.5 million, and that generated over $22 million in economic activity in the Kayenta region. So you can see it's very, very beneficial to the region, to the folks that worked on it, and to Navajo Nation in general on a long-term basis. Next slide. The next couple of slides I put in here are to indicate what we have used to speak to tax investors. Now, Kayenta 2 utilized investment tax credits as partial funding for the project. The rest of the funding was through the Rural Utility Service. Kayenta 1, we did not use investment tax credits, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this gives you an idea of what investors look for when you're about to build a project. And I won't go through all the details, but you can see that they look obviously at the size, the location, who the off-taker is, what the length of the power purchase agreement is, what kind of leases you have you gotten your permitting, is the PPA in place, so on and so forth. A lot of information, and we try to put this in a nice, neat package so that we can give this presentation to investors and then answer questions based on that. Next slide, please. Of course, they're interested in the PPA, so this gives potential investors an idea of what is in the PPA. Now, again, if you notice at the very, very top, the seller and the buyer, it's NGI/2 NTUA/2 SRP. So it's a little bit different than you might normally find just a direct offtake, let's say from NTUA to SRP, but it's because we created NGI as a separate entity which has to sell to NTUA so that NTUA can then sell to the offtaker. And again, this just explains all the various pieces of it. In this case, for Kayenta 2, our term price is $55 a megawatt hour. Now, that was back in 2019. Actually, it was negotiated earlier than that. Prices have dropped since that time. So again, this is and Edward mentioned that in his presentation. It's a moving target. Term is 30 years. The EPC contract has been executed. Construction dates are shown. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there's always interest in what the interconnection agreement looks like. There's a lot more detail to it, but this is what we provide, and then we go into detail from here. But the interconnection is key. It's very important, and again, as I mentioned, it's important to have some proximity to a robust transmission system or the ability to construct one in order for a project to be successful. If the proximity is not available, the cost goes up substantially and it becomes less and less beneficial to build the project. Next slide. I'm going to just show you a slide of performance so you get an idea of what these projects actually project. Now, if you notice, in year 1, we've got 80.98 gigawatt hours as the expected performance. And I say expected because this is all based on engineering design, which is based on expected radiance, angle of the sun, and so on. Now, the expected and the actual, and this is something that we'll talk about a little bit more at the end, aren't always the same, but let's assume they are for now. This is what actually occurs in the overall output of a solar project over time. It essentially degrades, and this is normal, it's expected, and it's designed. And it usually degrades about 0.05-0.04% per year. So if you notice, as we go down from year 1 all the way down to year 25, by the time we hit year 25, there's a substantial drop. So if you have a PPA, obviously you can't do the PPA based on year 1, you've got to do an average. Or if you're doing a set amount, and that's what we do with our PPAs. We have a set amount, or a PPA can just be whatever is produced. So there's a couple of ways of doing it. If you do whatever's produced, then the output is what it is. If you do a fixed amount, then it has to be averaged so that you account for the degradation. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to just talk a little bit about our upcoming projects. The first one is what's known as the Red Mesa Tapaha Solar Project. Next slide. Red Mesa initially was a 70 megawatt project, which is now a 72, has just become a 72 megawatt project. Again, it's a moving target, but in this case, very good. It'll serve both the citizens of Navajo Nation and 16 municipal utilities who are members of the Utah Associated Municipal Power System, or what's known as UAMPS. It's scheduled to deliver power to UAMPS in the third quarter 2022. We expect to start construction in approximately 3 weeks. So we are sitting right on top of getting this project underway. UAMPS has agreed to purchase 66 megawatts of the 72 for a period of 25 years. The remaining 6 megawatts will go to Navajo Nation, to customers in the Red Mesa area. The project itself is on about 550 acres, and it will create about 300 new jobs and approximately 7.2 million in additional salary. In addition, we are going to provide fiber optics for that area, which does not exist. It's a relatively remote area, of course, as much of the reservation is, but this particular area is particularly remote. So fiber optics will also be built into the area and available for our customers in that region. Next slide, please. The benefits, again, hundreds of solar construction jobs, specialized training, roughly 9-month construction period. We host job fairs. In fact, we hosted our first job fair about a month ago and had about 350 people applying for jobs. It keeps electric rates low in that area, as I mentioned, and also provides revenue for building out to those folks that don't have power, which this particular project will be dedicated to folks in Red Mesa area itself. Next slide, please. Again, this particular project, Red Mesa, will generate about $4 million in taxes. It's expected to generate about $140,000 per year, or $4.2 million over the life of the project in lease and real estate taxes. The $7.2 million in wages will generate over 20 million in economic activity in that area, and that's substantial because I can't emphasize enough how remote these areas are and how that revenue is significant to the folks in those areas. And again, 1.35 million in additional sales tax dollars from the wages just from that particular project. Next slide. To give you a sense, and this goes along with some of the things that Edward is talking about, but this will give you some specifics as to what we've had to do in order to make the project go, to get permits for it, and to actually finally get permission. We worked with the Navajo Nation government to complete the biological and cultural resource compliance studies necessary for the land lease. We submitted that legislation to Navajo Nation's General Land Development Department, and then met with the Navajo Nation Division of Natural Resources and Minerals. Essentially, there are a lot of steps from a regulatory and legislative standpoint specific to Navajo Nation that we have to go through for these projects, and they tend to change a little bit depending upon which project and where they are. So it's not always the same, but this is what we went through in Red Mesa. Next slide, please. So let me step up to the Cameron project, because that is expected to be built later on in 2022, so right after Red Mesa. Next slide. So phase one, because this is a multi-phase project. So phase one is on 1,100 acres. It's a 200 megawatt project. Again, we went through the chapter process and got a resolution passed. We worked with Salt River Project to conduct a competitive procurement process with them, in partnership with them. They specified that only a tribal entity would be allowed to bid this particular project, and that of course was us, so we did. And we ultimately negotiated with Navajo Nation itself the use of 100 megawatts of transmission capacity on the transmission line that will run and down to the Phoenix area. And let me just explain what that's about. When the Navajo generating station, a coal-fired station, closed in 2019, it freed up approximately 500 megawatts of transmission capacity that was given to Navajo Nation for their use. So we actually negotiate with the nation itself for certain allocations of that transmission capacity. And in this particular case, we negotiated for 100 megawatts. Next slide, please. I mentioned that we tried to use investment tax credit funding for our projects, and other than Kienta 1, all of our projects use that type of funding. In this case, we are partnering with D.E. Shaw. We've partnered with D.E. Shaw on Red Mesa and Cameron, and we will most likely partner with them on others. And this is just I won't go through the information on D.E. Shaw, but they are very, very much involved in tax investment financing with numerous renewable projects throughout the country. Next slide, please. So what will Cameron's project do? Create about 100 construction jobs, salary of about 8.3 million, and it will require infrastructure development within the region to promote further renewable and business development. The Cameron region, because of its location above Flagstaff, Arizona, has a lot of potential for additional economic development. And it will allow us to, again, provide new infrastructure for fiber optics, water, wastewater, low voltage power interconnection, and so on. Next slide, please. So I won't go through all this, but I put this slide in here to demonstrate some of the things that NTUA does with each one of the chapters that we deal with in providing the solar projects, because we work very closely with the chapters to make sure that they are either compensated or that there's an exchange of benefits between the chapter and NTUA so that everyone benefits. And in this case, this is just an overview of what we did through the CARES Act of 2020, just in Cameron itself. And I won't go through all the various things we did, but we invested a lot of money in Cameron. We do a lot of different things, and one of the things that is noted on here are the scholarships that we provide. In every case, when we build a project, we provide at least 2 full scholarships each year for 2 students in those chapters, and that's one of the things we do here. Next slide, please. And again, the direct benefits are the creation of hundreds of solar construction jobs, specialized training. This will be a longer construction period because of the size. It's 200 megawatts. Job fairs, scholarships. The unfortunate part of ongoing operations of solar projects is they don't create a lot of full-time jobs. This one will create 4 full-time jobs. Next slide. And this particular project will provide significant financial benefits to the area. 90 million over the 30-year life of the project, 6 million in taxes to Navajo Nation. And one thing that I have failed to mention, but in every case, we return a portion of the leasing costs that we provide to Navajo Nation. A portion of that goes directly to the chapter, and that's one of the benefits that they get. So you can see what all the, again, what all the financial benefits are here. This will have approximately 8.3 million in wages, which will generate about 25 million in economic activity for the Navajo Nation. Next slide. And this is the timeline of what we've done. Again, and if I go through here, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a different process for what we did here versus what we did in Red Mesa. And that is something that we have learned in dealing with each one of these projects, that the process that we go through each time is a little bit different depending upon where it is on the nation, what chapter is involved, and so on. So I won't go through each piece here, but what this particular slide does is it demonstrates the fact that the process is not always the same, and we can't base our initial development activity on the last project. Each one is a new process. Next slide. So finally, what did we learn? Well, we've learned quite a bit, and we continue to learn. The first thing, and probably the most important thing, is to continue to educate stakeholders. Educate stakeholders of grazing rights, the chapters, the governmental officials, and continue to do so. You have to continue to bring them up to date on what the status of the project is, and recognize that particularly in chapters, that many times the officials of the chapters change and they need to be re-educated. So this is a very, very important piece of the initial development process. Assure fair compensation where appropriate, and that goes to chapters. As I mentioned, we do provide a percentage of the lease costs back to the chapters, to the grazing rights holders. We compensate them for the loss of their grazing rights, and so on, and make sure it's fair and appropriate. Obtain financing early. I mentioned that Kayenta 1 did not include investment tax credits because we were late to the game. We didn't start that piece of the financing early enough, and time ran out on us, and we weren't able to obtain investment tax financing on Kayenta 1. So that's really an important piece, especially if you're going to use investment tax credits. Analyze and engineer the equipment to operate effectively with on-site conditions. Again, we learned a very difficult lesson in Kayenta. Given the dust conditions, the inverters were not built particularly to recognize the amount of dust, and we've had issues with that. I won't go into lots of detail, but that's a very, very important piece. Hire a financially stable construction EPC. Our first project, we had difficulty in getting an EPC contractor to work with a tribal entity because it hadn't been done before, a large utility scale solar project on a tribal land. So the EPC contractor that we used finished the project and promptly went out of business. Not the best way to do business. So please make sure that the EPC contractor that you do utilize is financially stable. Retain a third-party operations and maintenance provider. That's important because most tribal entities don't have the in-house expertise to operate and maintain large-scale solar projects such as these. And that's exactly what we've done. Create an in-house dedicated solar administration group. At the same time, while the expertise isn't initially there, create that type of expertise so that you have it and it continues to grow over time. As I mentioned earlier, expect variance in actual versus design expectations. Don't set a PPA output expectation on what the design expectation is, because for many reasons that may not be met. And then finally, integrate the cost of major spare components, inverters, transformers, and so on in the overall project budget. Spare parts are always included, but the major components aren't necessarily included as a spare. We had a significant fire in one of our inverters, and getting a replacement is extremely difficult. So these are our lessons learned. These are the projects that we have built, owned, and operate. And these are also the projects that we're about to build, own, and operate. And as I mentioned, by 2024, we'll have over 1 gigawatt of solar energy provided on Navajo Nation. Next slide. I want to thank you for listening to our efforts at NTUA and look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you, Glenn. And we do have tons of questions that are coming in, so FYI, we'll have a lot of questions here at the end. Wonderful presentation, just a lot of great detail there, and a lot of wonderful success. So that's amazing work that you and the team are doing there at NTUA, and it's great that you're sharing it with our audience here. Next, we're going to move on to our last presentation for today. John from the Loan Programs Office is going to tell us about their programs and how they can fit into large-scale solar development. Looks like your slides are up, John.
Great. So thanks very much, James, for that introduction, and thank you, Lizana and Office of Indian Energy, for giving us the opportunity to participate in today's webinar. Also want to thank the other members of the panel. I think both Edward and Glenn have done great setup for what I'll briefly cover here. I think Edward did a great job, I think, in providing the audience sort of a general framework of how to go about large-scale solar energy project development. And then I think you heard from Glenn just really solid experiences and case studies and great lessons learned. So great that this is going to be recorded, because I think those are great resources for folks to go back and listen to as they contemplate, or they're in sort of the middle of project development for tribes on solar projects or other projects. So I think really great material here. As Lizana mentioned and James mentioned, I'm with the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office. We have a number of different programs that we administer that support tribal energy innovation, economic development, both working with what we would call regular solar projects, as well as some other projects that tribes can access as well, maybe dealing with more innovative technologies. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly for folks and certainly allow for additional time for questions, because I know there's a number of questions that have been generated already, and glad to answer those and look forward to following up on those as we have time. So next slide, please. So generally speaking, and just as an introduction, the Loan Programs Office is here as a separate office within the Department of Energy. We operate independently of our sister organization, the Office of Indian Energy, but work very closely with them. We are essentially the Department of Energy's, if you will, financing arm for new technologies and for other programs that address sort of gaps in the financing market for energy projects. So we provide access to debt capital where other lenders are not available for a number of different reasons. We can structure that financing to be very flexible in different ways, working with different lenders and different forms of equity. And I think the real thing that we like to emphasize is, and I think you've seen great examples of that here today, these are complicated projects, and they take a significant time to develop. They take a large degree of expertise in a number of different areas. And so we like to partner with organizations that are undertaking these, recognizing some of the challenges that go into these projects, and very prepared to work with you over the long term to bring these projects into being. So those things I hope we are understandable and rememberable about the presentation. Next slide, please. We've done a significant number of transactions, large-scale solar, large-scale wind. We've also done a number of other projects in other spaces as well. But certainly to the topic of this presentation here today, we were really the first debt financing for large-scale solar projects in the United States back in 2010, 2011. So the types of projects that both Ed and Glenn were talking about, we are very, very familiar with them, understand how those projects come together, both from a planning standpoint, an engineering standpoint, and a financing standpoint. And so are, as I said, a ready partner to work with tribes in bringing those projects forward. Next slide, please. So I want to kind of just offer this slide, and I know that Ed sort of offered sort of his 4 or 5 keys to success. I think Glenn also did as well, and sort of recognizing and just I guess repeating that a number of different things need to come together, you know, for these projects to be successful. I think Glenn talked about the power purchase agreement, the need to secure offtake on those, dealing with investment grade entities. It may be a utility. You also see a lot of activity by corporate offtakes as well. The interconnection agreement, dealing with either a regulated utility or in an unregulated region of the United States, but certainly understanding how that power is going to move onto the grid and ultimately going to have transmission access to get to the final customer. The contracts and permitting, be it on the panels themselves, ecological permitting, environmental permitting as well, and then also construction contracts. I think Glenn touched on this briefly, the need to have experienced, reputable engineering, procurement, and construction contractors, contractors for transmission and substations, and operation and maintenance after the construction is completed, and then be able to provide a financial model that is presentable to a funding source, a financing source, something that's been reviewed by independent engineers, and as necessary, additional insurance consultants. And finally, bringing in equity to the project as well, and whether that's tax equity or developers equity, other forms of equity, making sure that those things are secured and provided for the project. And again, we recognize that these are complex projects, that these take many years to form. This is a slide that actually was provided, as you can see, by our friends over at KeyBank. And I like to use it because in looking at financing, certainly having the view of a bank and how a bank looks at these types of deals, I think is very, very important, and really emphasizes the different points that need to be addressed as the project gets put together. I think one of the things to notice on this is financial aspects of this are relatively low in the stack. They're toward the end of the process, and working on some of the other things really are higher in the list. I know that Glenn sort of mentioned that, you know, getting to financing early is one of the keys to success, and I think he would probably agree with me. I think that's a relative statement, and making sure that you have some of these other things addressed, making sure that there's adequate resource studies, adequate design done, a power purchase agreement is either completed or is in process, all these other things of interconnection agreements, contracts, and permits, making sure that all those are addressed to a significant point will make it much easier then to bring your project into a bank, into a source of tax equity or equity, and make it much easier to get financing. So making sure that some of the hard project aspects are addressed just makes the whole financing process much easier. So next slide. So where does LPO fit in that discussion? So as I mentioned, we have several different programs that we administer that help tribes access capital for tribal energy projects. The one here that is spelled out very clearly for tribes is our Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program. That program is one where we work in partnership with banks. So a tribe would originally apply for a loan with a lender, and the lender can be a regulated lender or a tribal lender. But then that lender would come to us for a loan guarantee, and that loan guarantee can be up to 90% of the loan value. So it's basically making that loan essentially 90% risk-free for the lender. The purpose here is to make sure that there are more lenders who are willing to participate with Native American tribes and Native American entities like NTUA in developing these projects for Indian country. So that's clearly a project, or clearly a program that is out front for tribes to access for the types of energy projects that have been covered. The other program that we also like to highlight is what's called the Title 17 Innovative Energy Loan Guarantee Program. That particular program allows us to provide actually loan guarantees similar to the tribal program, but it also allows us to be what we would call a direct lender, in that you don't need to work through a bank necessarily. You can come to us directly to apply for funding through the federal government. And in that case, it's 100% loan from the federal government that we would provide. Now that can be provided through one of three different areas. We have advanced fossil, we have an advanced nuclear component, and we also have a renewable energy program as well that offers up to $4.5 billion of funding under that program. And that would be one that certainly would be available to tribes. It's not exclusive to tribes, but one that we want to make sure tribes are aware of as they look especially at some of these large-scale projects. The difference between the Title 17 and the TELP program is that the Title 17 program has a requirement that some level of innovative technology is used. So the types of solar projects here that Ed and Glenn discussed probably wouldn't go under Title 17. We would probably look at it more as a tribal program. But for tribes that are looking at maybe more innovative technologies, potentially with innovative storage types or other aspects of innovation, then the Title 17 program could certainly be a funding source for those tribes to want to become familiar with. So those are really, I think, the two key programs here that we would like to emphasize. Both of them provide significant capital, debt capital for tribes, and can be a significant tool as you look to financing for some of these other large-scale projects. Next slide, please. This just kind of gives you a little bit more detail on the tribal energy project, or on the tribal energy loan guarantee program. We can do very long-term capital on this, up to 30 years. We would certainly want to match that sort of with the terms of the PPA, but one of the things that really differentiates us from conventional capital is our ability and authorization to go to long terms. Those long terms make it more affordable for tribes, or allow tribes to offer more competitive pricing on a project. These projects do not necessarily need to be on tribal lands. Certainly if they are on tribal lands, that certainly fits within the scope of the program. That we have also talked with tribes that are looking at projects that are located off the reservation lands, but still somewhere in the United States. The one thing to emphasize is that these are loan guarantees or loans in the case of the Title 17. And we look at them to establish that there is a reasonable prospect of repayment, some financial viability, so that the government understands that there's a pathway to get paid back over the term of the loan. As you can see on the right-hand side, we have a number of ways we can apply this program, not just for renewable energy, but as well as for other types of energy projects. Next slide, please. This gives you some additional detail. Much of this I've already covered. In the interest of time, we'll just go ahead and go to the next slide. And some of this I've already covered, but again, on the renewable energy and efficient energy program, really the requirement is using innovative technologies. Those technologies must somehow result in reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Does not need to be located on tribal lands, just anywhere in the United States, and again, be financially viable, but a number of different ways. And we've had, I know this is a webinar focused specifically on solar, but to the extent that tribes are looking at other technologies, both of these programs can be applied to a large number of technologies beyond solar. And next slide, please. And again, some additional terms which we'll leave here for reference, and any questions after this presentation or anything that anybody wants to reach out to us. Next slide, please. And there is my contact information. As I indicated, on the tribal program, the formal application is made by a lender, but we certainly encourage engagement and what we would call a pre-application meeting with tribes directly. So please, if you're looking at large-scale projects, solar projects or other projects, we certainly encourage you to come talk with us about your project, any particular aspects of the project that you have questions on, understanding our process a little bit more, what the timelines are around that, and some of the things that we look for in terms of successful projects. But I think you've got great material here between Ed and Glenn in terms of ways to think about successful project development, and some great lessons learned and examples of tribal projects that have been successfully completed. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to you, James, and be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, John. Another excellent presentation with a lot of good information in it. So thank you for that. And yeah, to our audience, all of these slide decks are going to be posted on our website, and you'll receive an email with the specific web address for where the slides are located, and they'll be posted, reasonably shortly to our website. And you can check back in about a week, and you'll also see the recording on our website. So keep that in mind. So yeah, let's jump into our questions. I'm just going to go down the list because we have quite a few here, and I'll get to as many as we can. First off, a question for you, Glenn, and that is, can you talk about land availability on Navajo Nation? Is there, you said a gigawatt of projects basically in the pipeline. Is there still more opportunity there and available land?
Yeah, the answer is yes. Yeah, there are quite a few sites that are agreeable for the development of solar, and it's just a matter of working with the chapters and the grazing rights holders more than anything else. That's the biggest, and it's not a hurdle necessary because it's just part of what needs to be done. But as far as land availability, yes, there's quite a bit. We look at 1 gigawatt as what we expect to get within the next couple of years. After that, there's still much more potential.
Excellent, thanks. Next question here is more general, but probably applicable to either Edward or Glenn. How large of a parcel of land would a tribe need for a utility scale project? I think obviously that depends on the size of the project, but maybe acres per megawatt would be appropriate. And then do you have any thoughts on what sort of land ownership is more ideal, fee versus trust lands? Let's stop there.
Edward here, I can speak briefly to it. I use a rule of thumb of generally 5 to 8 acres per megawatt for a utility scale solar project. So take your size, 50, 100 megawatts, whatever, multiply it by that 5 to 8 acres to the megawatt, and you come up with a pretty good number. With respect to fee land versus trust land, each carries its own issues, but I would say it's an issue of whether the tribe decides that they want to basically work a project on their land as part of their program. So, anybody else want to offer?
I think you've answered that very well, very well.
And I'm jumping a little bit out of order here, but maybe this is applicable to the last question a little bit. Glenn, can you talk at all about the permitting process? Did your projects require EISs?
Yes.
Yeah, did land ownership impact that?
Yes. Yeah, it involved EIS, it involved a number of different permitting processes. And as I mentioned, the one thing that we found, and we are finding as we go through developing multiple projects, is each project tends to have its own set of requirements, and not all the same. But bottom line is, yes, we do need to go through all the traditional permitting and acquiring rights. So nothing unusual there.
Thank you. Moving back a little bit to my previous question, they also wanted to know, Glenn, I think you mentioned a buyback option for one of the projects, and I guess it's not jumping to mind how that would play in, but if you recall, can you elaborate on opportunity for the I guess the Navajo Nation to buy back in, or maybe Edward, you can talk about it a little bit more, just in terms of project structures and sale leaseback and the like. I think the question is probably just trying to understand how tribes can eventually obtain full ownership of projects.
Well, in our case, we have full ownership. We have full ownership. What we do is partner with investment tax credit firms, and generally that's a 7-year partnership. So at the end of the 7 years, then yeah, that's the buyback period, in which case we retain full ownership. Don't have to do it that way. That's the way we choose to do it. But in every case so far, NTUA is the full owner of the project.
Yeah, I just would add there that Glenn hit the important point there, which is essentially tax credit qualification. Since the value of the tax credit as well as the accelerated depreciation is a substantial portion of the equivalent capital cost of the project, it's really important to try to secure those benefits if at all possible. So I would also just add, and I'm sure Glenn would agree with this, that when it comes down to it, those types of arrangements are probably subject to the negotiations with developer and lending institution or whatever, your tax equity investor. It's just another negotiating aspect as to when the transfer or flip or whatever is going to occur.
Yeah, let me add to that a little bit, because I mentioned in the presentation about the fact that we did not receive any investment tax credit financing for Canto 1 because we ran out of time, which is why I mentioned the fact that, you know, get financing early and recognizing that you need to have all the other pieces in place too, but as early as possible. What occurred was investment tax credit financing has very strict requirements, particularly in terms of when the plant goes into commercial operation. And essentially, the day or the hour that you provide the first electron of output of that plant is the last day you can close on investment tax credit financing. And that's a really important issue. And we ran into that on Canto 1. We ran out of time.
Great, thanks for clarifying that, Glenn. Another question here, and I think it was you, Edward, who was talking about the importance of maintaining flexibility in the documents, because in the legal documents and contracts, because the projects evolve a little bit. Can you elaborate on that in any detail? Are there templates that are available for these PPAs and the other land lease agreements, all those sorts of things? How do you know what's kind of appropriate, or how do you maintain that flexibility in these contracts?
Yeah, I think I would just preface the entire discussion around my general advice for the last 10 or 20 years, which was passed on to me, is anytime you're thinking about setting up a business, one of the first people you want to call is a good corporate attorney. And so I'm not advocating necessarily for any attorneys or whatever, but it can be a sizable expense. But legal advice is just critically important as you begin to set up your agreements, and getting expert advice in terms of what's expected to be more or less commercial terms, if you will, is important. The point I was trying to make, though, is that ultimately when you do approach a financier to invest in the project, whether it's for tax equity or a lending institution, there are probably going to be things within the agreements that the lender or financial institution or tax equity investor, that they're going to want to perhaps flex a bit. I think off the top of my head, I don't want to get into any specifics, frankly, because it can have to do with the term, possible extensions. It can do with transferability. For example, is it okay to transfer it from one development entity to a separate company, keep going? But there are lots of issues like that, and I would suggest that John probably also has some great input on that question as well from the financial perspective.
John, do you want to jump in on it?
Well, I think a lot of different ways to structure it, but I think, again, these projects are all going to hinge on having advisors, technical advisors, legal and financial advisors to ultimately put together and to structure, and no one tribe should think that they're going to be expected to be able to pull all this together. And there's a number of good sources of information and a good community of advisors out there to take advantage of.
Great, thanks, John. A question here on interconnection to 100 kV transmission lines. Can you talk about, and this is maybe an Edward or maybe Glenn, challenges interconnecting to such high voltage lines? Is it just more expensive? Is there a certain scale you need to reach before that makes sense? Obviously, there's a high voltage line available maybe to a tribe.
Well, let me take a shot at that. It really is dependent upon the size of the project that you have. whether you need to do that or not. So if what you have is an existing 100 unit there, then it's just a matter of building the interconnect to accommodate that. It's not really any kind of unusual thing to do that. You can pretty much interconnect at any size. I'm trying to think the best way to describe this, but if it's a small project, let's say 15 megawatts or 20 megawatts, you can interconnect that at a relatively low voltage, at 34 kV, for example. You could do that. Okay, but as you get higher and higher into the size of the project, then you need a higher voltage level to interconnect to. So it really is dependent upon the size of the project you're building, and the amount of line that needs to be built between the interconnect and I'm assuming now, the existing transmission line. So that's it's not the easiest question to answer without having specifics.
Yeah, and I guess I can give you a little specifics. They've clarified it's APS's El Dorado 500 kV line. So maybe it would just be an answer is like you need a project that's at least 50 megawatts to justify building an interconnect at such a high voltage, or I don't know generally
at 500, at 500 kV, yeah, that's a whole different. At 500, you need a large project to interconnect. For example, the 450 megawatt project we're building in Lachie, that will interconnect at the 500 kV level.
Great, thanks, Glenn. Another question for you, Glenn. Can you elaborate on the tax equity structure for your projects? Were they partnership flips? How are they structured?
They're partnerships. As I mentioned in the presentation, we have partnered with D.E. Shaw on 3 projects and with AT&I on 1 total so far. So they are all structured pretty much the same in that they're 7-year amortization periods. They're 30% investment, so essentially it's a 30%, 70% split, and that's pretty much it. That's the overall scope of our engagements with tax equity.
Great. And this is another question for you, Glenn. We're getting into the specifics here, but you talked about how they're shaped power. The PPAs are for shaped power. Can you talk about how you shape it? There was no mention of storage.
Yeah. These are the 2 Kayenta projects are unique. What we did is we negotiated a PPA with SRP that SRP would accept all of the RECs, the renewable energy credits, from those 2 projects as they come out, essentially, but based on a 78,000 megawatt hour expectation each year. So that's what the expectation is, but the RECs are as generated. However, the energy is separate. The energy is sold to SRP in a shaped format. So essentially the energy is coming from our portfolio of supply and not directly from the plant. So the energy from the plant stays, it would anyway, of course, stays on Navajo Nation, and we supply SRP with a product that is very clearly shaped to their needs, and depending upon season and hour of day. But it's not directly associated with the output of the solar plant. And that's why it's a little bit different, a little bit unusual.
Interesting. So NTUA generation and transmission is essentially serving as a battery, so to speak, to shape the power.
Yes.
This is probably another either Glenn or Edward question talking about land leases. How do you know what is market for a land lease and what's the appropriate value? How do you establish that appropriate value for a land lease?
I've been answering a lot. I'll let Edward answer that one.
I was afraid you were going to do that, Glenn. Seriously, you can see in the presentation that I provided that there were some numbers in there that in the hypothetical scenario that was put forward. And I think it was something like $300 to $600 an acre. I could be wrong, but forgot what I wrote in there. But the point, though, is that that number, as I recall, was based on this big survey that we did involving more fee land structures, so not necessarily totally appropriate to a tribal land setting. You may find that there are substantially higher than that or lower, and it really just goes back to kind of the same thing as a power purchase agreement or kind of the same thing as tax equity investment or anything else. Some of these things, they go back to the negotiation. What's the value of the land, for example, as it's currently being used? Is there a business opportunity that's competing for the land that you're proposing to put a solar project on? Can you get somebody to actually, as a registered appraisal, a certified appraiser, can you get a vacant land appraiser to come out and pinpoint some sort of a value as currently in use versus as used as a solar property, and see if you can establish some sort of value per acre for the plot of land? That's about the best answer that I can provide on that, and it's really, really site dependent. Now I'll ask Glenn if that was a pretty good answer.
That's a very good answer, and I will add to it and say that what we have found in negotiating the land leases for each one of our projects is that it changes. So, I noticed the question asked, what's the market? And I would say, at least in the projects that we've negotiated with Navajo Nation, I wouldn't call it a market. I'd call it a negotiation, depending upon the site, depending upon a number of other factors, but there's no real market, and it's really hard to appraise it too, because most of the property, if not all of it, that we use is just open grazing land, so it's based on that. But what we have found is it's changed. The dollars per acre has changed with each project.
Thank you both. We're a little bit over. If I may ask, can we squeeze a couple more questions in? John had to leave, but Ed and Edward and Glenn, you got a couple more minutes?
I'm here. Yep.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. And this is a Glenn question. You talked a little bit about bundling the infrastructure on your projects. It sounded like you were tying in fiber optics and water on a lot of them. Were those necessary upgrades to build the projects and maintain the projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes. It's a necessary upgrade for the project itself, yes. But what we do is we leverage that in every single case. Every case when we will bring, obviously there's power to it, we bring water to it, and we bring fiber optics to it. And in doing that, then we leverage that so that we can expand that to the local residents and whatever commercial establishments require that too. And that's been very beneficial. As I mentioned, when we did Canto 1, we literally had folks on site that were not served with electric and water, and we leveraged the fact that we were able to bring that to the project in order to bring it to them. So yeah, we try to bundle it in every case.
Great. Talking about fixed axis versus single axis tracking, Glenn, are all your projects single axis tracking?
Yes.
And is that even a consideration to go fixed in your estimation? Yeah, like how do you make that decision?
Well, we did early on. We did all the calculations, the cost benefits, and so on, and it became very, very clear that fixed access was what was going to work best for us, because if we were using it just for our own purposes, it might have a different calculus. But since we're in every case, we are dealing with export through PPAs, so we needed to maximize the output.
Okay, thank you. It looked like you. Go ahead, Edward.
I'm sorry, I was just going to kind of add on to what Glenn was suggesting there. He referred to the economic calculation, if you will, between these two scenarios. And I would just say that when you're talking about single axis tracking versus fixed, you're talking about moving parts, additional moving parts that require additional maintenance and operation considerations. And you also require, depending on weather conditions, you require potentially more significant engineering for that capability. And it really goes against the additional generation that you're going to get out of the system by having that single axis tracking. And it could be what, 10 to 15%, Glenn, maybe 20%?
Yeah, that's right about where we were. I would say roughly 15% is what we looked at up front. And it's absolutely true. You know, now that we've built the plants and we know what it takes to operate them and what the costs are and so on. So that's about right.
Great, thank you. A simple question here, probably, Edward. With Montana winters, are there any issues in solar technology? Will it stand up to the harsh winters?
Well, I would love to see Montana. Start with that. I understand that there are harsh conditions in Montana, but I would suggest that there's even solar projects in Alaska, and I'm pretty sure there's plenty of them in Montana. Here again, it comes back to design, and maybe that's one of those where if you're sitting out there and your winds are gale force winds and you're getting tons of snow, there may be certain conditions that you have to take into consideration as you design and engineer and think about financing the project. But I would suggest that solar can find a home pretty much anywhere in the US and in our territories.
And this will be the last question. Resource assessment for solar. Do these large-scale projects require on-site resource assessment? And if so, how long does that take? Or can you just use, model maps?
So it's been my experience that you're going to have a resource assessment, but it's not like wind resources where you set up various met towers and then you get to micrositing issues and so forth. With solar, I think there are some really good resources out there to establish the solar capability, if you will, but usually there is some on-site monitoring that does get done just to kind of validate what is essentially there and establish a good P50, P99 case for financing. And Glenn, can you share what you guys had to face?
Exactly that. We did some on-site. We used existing, but we also used on-site. And, we did the very best estimates of radiance and so on. And yet, as I mentioned in the presentation, we still haven't achieved what we expected to achieve. So you do the best you can, but we did do exactly what you just explained. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you both for staying on and sticking with us to get as many questions as we could answered. We're going to cut it off here. But thank you both for your time and excellent presentations today. And thank you, John, for yours as well. I know you aren't on anymore. We are very interested in general in suggestions on how to strengthen the value of these webinars, so please do email any feedback to us at indianenergy@hq.doe.gov, and I sent that email address out in the chat earlier. This is the final webinar of the 2021 Tribal Energy Webinar Series, but we are currently preparing for the 2022 series, so please keep an eye out for the details on next year's series, and if you have ideas for topics you would like covered, send an email to that indianenergy@hq.doe.gov website. Thanks once again for our audience's interest today, and we look forward to you joining us on future webinars. This concludes today's webinar. Good day.